Hello everyone. I hope you are doing good, and today we are going to continue our class of literary theory and criticism. We have already discussed so many. I think I'll just revise. We have discussed Bharat Muni, Anandavardhan, Plato, Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, and we are left with only two, Dante and Boccaccio, in the section called classical criticism. And here we are going to in this class we'll discuss Renaissance criticism, and we'll try to finish all of this in this session itself. So anyway, tell me quickly in the chat box, are you there? Say yes in the chat box quickly, so I'll know who else are there. Great. Priya is here. So we'll start. We'll start with Dante Alighieri. So first you have to know about the lifespan of this particular Italian poet, writer, and philosopher. So he lived around 1265 BC to 1321. Okay, got it. I just woke up and I've started teaching. Maybe I feel a little bit anyway, we'll just start our class with energy so everybody will wake up. I hope everybody has taken their nap. I did. Tell me, Priya, if you have taken nap, or also Anjali, Kirti. So all my favorite students are here already, and we are going to start with Dante Alighieri. Again, lifespan is 1265 to 1321. Remember Dante Alighieri, why we know him? Because of the Divine Comedy, and he's Italian poet, writer, and we are just going to discuss about a little bit about his life, so you will be able to judge when something related to come Dante Alighieri. So remember, his birth is 1265. Sometime they ask to arrange author in particular date of birth. So by birth they ask in chronological type of questions. Okay, Vidya is also here. Very good to see everyone here. And when he was 12, he fell in love with Beatrice. So all of his work are inspired or somehow mentioned about Beatrice, and her name was Beatrice Portinari, and whom he continued to write about throughout his life. So there are love poems dedicated to Beatrice, and where we'll find La Vita Nova, or the new life. And again, he's mostly influenced by Homer and Virgil. When Dante was 18, he met poets like Guido Cavalcanti, Lapo Gianni, Shino da Pistoia, and others. And Purgatorio, Dante discusses philosophy, a subject that the character of Beatrice criticizes in Purgatorio. So we are going to discuss Dante's other Divine Comedy in detail. We'll discuss somewhere else. Here we are only discussing his poetical and criticism part of literary career. So in that session we are only going to discuss that. Just for brief, I have put about the Divine Comedy. Remember, everything is related to 13. So 1-3. So remember that here. The Divine Comedy, that will be easy for you to guess if you know the date. So it began in 1308 and was published in 1320, year before his death in 1321. Remember, it follows Dante's main character's journey through hell, and he crosses Inferno, Purgatorio, and eventually reaches to Paradiso, where he met who? He was guided by his guide was Virgil, and then in later part he met his beloved Beatrice. Again, why? Because Beatrice, he was in love when he was 13 only. And Dante wrote of his path of salvation, offering philosophical and moral judgment along the way. So Dante is credited with Terza Rima. Everything is with like 3. Remember, 1308 and 1320 he completed, and inventing Terza Rima, and the Divine Comedy Terza Rima ends with canto with a single line. So that is also very important. The single line completes the rhyme scheme with the end word of second line of previous tercet. Everything related to terza and 13 and all, right? 3. And how, we will know here. So the Divine Comedy was written in vernacular Italian instead of more acceptable Latin or Greek. And T.S. Eliot said about Dante that Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no third. So that was the statement that T.S. Eliot made, and that statement has they have asked in net also. Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no third. Who said it? It was T.S. Eliot. And here, why we are discussing our con vivo or the banquet, it's very important. It is an unfinished work, and it includes 4 trattati or books, and introductory 1 plus 3 books. Each book include canzone, long lyrical poem, and prose allegorical interpretation of commentary of the language. It is a kind of vernacular encyclopedia of the knowledge of Dante's time. And the treatise begin with the prefatory book or poem. Why Dante is important in our literary criticism? Because of the letter that he has written, and also he has written these things where he talked about the poetry and the form of his poem, like terza rima, tercet, and trattati. These all 13 kind of book, word. So letter to Can Grande in Della Scala, it was allegedly written in letter to Congrade 1 Della Scala, and it is talking about a pilgrimage from hell to paradise. Is a paradigmatic expression of comedy. It starts with pilgrim's moral confusion and ends with vision of Boccaccio. Why Boccaccio is important in literary criticism? Due to his work and the form, and mostly Chaucer and other people have modeled on Boccaccio. Some work that are famous is like the Decameron, and he was the known as 3 jewels: Petrarch, Dante, and Boccaccio. That's why they are quite important in Italian literature. And why he's used, promoted the use of Tuscan vernacular than the traditional Latin. Got it? And he was known for his experiment use of Tuscan and his promotion of ottava rima. So remember, terza rima, Dante. Got it? Terza rima is Dante here, and Boccaccio is related to, where is it? Ottava rima, where 8 line stanza and 11 syllable lines. Now the Decameron we know composed in 1348 to 52, and it was revised in 1317. We have to have guess about the we have to know about the order of these particular poet and writer. So Decameron, as we know, it is a masterpiece of Italian literature. Simple plot is there. A story about a 10 young Florentine, like we have who have fled the nearby town of Fiesole to escape the Black Plague, and there they tell each other stories culminating in 100 tales. So, like Chaucer's work was also Canterbury Tales are inspired from the Decameron, and where in Chaucer's pilgrimage everybody tells the tale. Here there are 10 young Florentine who fled to the nearby town of Fiesole to escape the Black Plague, and there they tell each other stories culminating in 100 tales. And L'Amorosa Vision, the Amorous Vision, it is narrative poem in 50 canto composed in terza rima. Again, some of other works are there. The commentary on Dante Divine Comedy. So it is kind of lecture that he has given on Dante that Boccaccio gave in Santo's temple. So this is all about section 1. Now we'll begin section 2. Write 2 in the chat box, so we'll start the class on Renaissance criticism unlocked. That is our book that called the name of the book is Literary Criticism and Literary Theory Unlocked. It's 251 pages in A4 size, but in other format of the book it has 400 pages, and that is, as I keep saying, it's very important in your exam. Okay, Vidya already said yes. Anyone else? So we'll start this Renaissance criticism right away. I hope everybody is excited. And why I just want to highlight a couple of things on this topic, that definitely you are going to get one question from that itself, and most certainly 90% you are getting, or I can say 99% question you are getting from Philip Sidney. And of course you might get from Samuel Daniel because of the defense of rhyme. Of course we're going to talk about Stephen Gashon, George Puttenham. All of these are important, and these days it's kind of trend, no, that they are asking Philip Sidney's contemporary who have done some work in criticism. So in that way, that's why this section is quite important in that exam. So I hope everybody is ready for that, and we'll start with the first just introduction about Renaissance criticism, what you're gonna find in this section. First, we have already discussed about classical ideas, where Plato says that poetry is the mother of lie, and it should not be it should be banished from the ideal state. And in the second one about Aristotle, that we thought he talked about poetry, but we don't have that part, and he says that poetry is the imitation of art, and it represents life, and he talked about tragedy, drama, and other things, right, that we have discussed before. And that idea is the backbone of whole literary criticism, and in somehow or there are like major relationship with classical ideas to Renaissance criticism. And who started this thing? It was starting by Stephen Gashon, and then Sidney, and the rest of the other critic. And Renaissance criticism, as I said, it all based on classical ideas of unity of form, content, were developed into literary neoclassical through the literary criticism of the Renaissance. So remember, this Renaissance are actually depend on classical ideas, whatever it was there. So it proclaims literature as central to culture, entrusting the poet and the author with preserving a long literary tradition. So in 1498, the first thing, Renaissance criticism was born with the recovery of the classical text. So it was in Renaissance that the Aristotle poetics was translated, such as Latin translation. It was in the beginning Latin. So Latin translation of Aristotle poetics by Giorgio Valla. So that's why this character is important, and because of that the criticism trend started. So until the late 18th century, Aristotle work, particular poetics significantly influenced literary criticism. So the whole till 18th century, late 18th century, everything was somehow related to Aristotle poetics and also Plato's criticism on poetry. So Aristotle poetics was one of the most influential texts in the Renaissance that we know, and because of the printing press which was introduced in 15th century, that enabled multiple copies of manuscript to be made, and it was available to everybody to read, and eventually everybody has their views, right, on poetry and the criticism. Anyway, the printing was unique, leading the spread of ancient knowledge to various readers and scholars. Starting with Lodovico Castelvetro. You must have not hear his name, but he's very important character. I mean, a very important critic in Renaissance, and why you will understand. His work contributed to the development of neoclassical criticism, especially in drama. So his reading of Aristotle led the widespread adoption of tight version of three unities as a dramatic standard. So as we know, Castelvetro is Italian, and he was born in Italy and died. He was born in Modena, Italy, and died in Chiavenna. And Poetica di Aristotle Vulgarizzata e Sposta. I don't know how to say. These are all Italian. So it was translated as, just you need to remember, the Poetics of Aristotle translated in the vulgar language and commented on. So it was called the most famous Italian Renaissance commentary on poetics. So everything began in Renaissance with this commentary on Aristotle. So that criticism trend started with Lodovico Castelvetro. We are just mentioning because that is the backbone of Renaissance criticism, and that is where everything started. And why we have mentioned William Caxton here, because of the printing, because of this text, whatever was there, that was available to every single reader and critics and scholars at that time. As we know, Mr. Caxton was a diplomat and writer, and he introduced the first printing press into England, and remember the date, 1476. And as a printer, he was the first English retailer of printed books. So Margaret convinced Caxton to complete his translation on History of Troy, and which contained stories related to Homer's Iliad. So he's known to have produced an edition of the Canterbury Tales, his translation of Aesop's Fables, and in 1484. Now, the another part of the Renaissance was Italian humanism, and that humanism is everything came from Petrarch. So when the word humanism come, you should remember the name Petrarch. So in the 16th century, the term humanist was coined to signify teaching or working in the study of humanity. So this studies was like far superior from the other studies other subjects. So humanities came under that, and this include grammar, translation, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. And remember, in some way, they all are a significant contribution in Renaissance criticism. And they emphasize learning to speak and write good Latin while focusing on classical, especially Latin culture. Italy was the birthplace of intellectual movement known as Renaissance humanism, and we know who's the one, and that is Petrarch, known as the father of humanism, that we have to remember. So they also wrote about education, ethics, politics, primary based on Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. So don't think it was only Philip Sidney started this trend. It was far like earlier than Sydney. So it was actually happening earlier. So it started with Castelvetro and other. And Petrarch, as we know, is known as the father of humanism, was also a significant figure. Erasmus of Rotterdam was the leading humanist. That is also, we have to remember, Petrarch Erasmus was the leading humanist scholar at the end of the 15th century, when the center of humanism shifted from Italy to northern. So at this time, that literature became the main subject at this time in Renaissance. That's why humanism plays important role in Renaissance age, and everything was started way before Philip Sidney. And in Renaissance, the humanist movement moved away from medieval scholasticism to and rekindled interest in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. So Christian humanism has become common in contemporary literature, especially among Sir Sidney, Edmund Spenser, and John Milton. Eliot supported medieval ideas of universal order. Again, another character is Castiglionis, and Castiglionis is also a Renaissance author. He's Italian, and Castiglione wrote Il Cortigiano. So the book of the courtier, very important one, and this once we have encountered this in net also. This book is the courtesy dealing with courtiers, question, ethic, and it was very influenced in 16th century European court circles. So they started the book. Castiglione wrote the book of the courtier. Now we come to the English Renaissance. The first person is Thomas Eliot, who was a scholar and English diplomat, and he was one of the first to advocate using English as a literary language. And Eliot supported the humanist ideas concerning women's education, writing to support learned women. He published the Defense of Good Women. And Sir Thomas Eliot, this question comes, the Book of Governor. These Renaissance critics are actually, they started coming in the exam due, and they mostly ask about match the following of these kind of work. Sir Thomas Eliot wrote the Book of Governor, and it was dedicated to Henry VIII, and is primarily a treatise on how to train statesmen properly. So the trend of guiding and about particularly, they have started writing about the guidebook and other things, right? So the Book of Governor is a treatise on how to train statesmen properly, and it also discusses ethical dilemma in the education system of the time. So we just need to remember the name, Sir Thomas Eliot, the Book of Governor. And why one more thing, we just need to look at it. According to Eliot, Homer contains incomparable wisdoms and instructions for politic politic governance of people, and lessons on military warfare. So that is our about Thomas Edison. Roger Ascham. Everybody knows about Roger Ascham and why it is important of the work Toxophilus. So these are all like guidebook or that's why you might have studied in literary uh, history of English literature these names, and you may have encountered it couple of time in exams as well. So that's why we have just added these author in this critic and this philosopher in our literary criticism and theory. So Roger Ascham, you should remember he wrote about the Toxophilus, and which is the lover of the bow. So it was published in 1545. Again, remember the order. It was dedicated to Henry VIII, and the purpose of this book was to commend the practice of shooting with the long bow and to set an example of higher style of composition that had been attempted in English. And Toxophilus was the first book on archery in English. So that was one question from the statement also. So it is a Platonic dialogue between Toxophilus and Philologus. Again, another guidebook is The Schoolmaster, 1570, about the teacher, how they should teach these kind of. So the Richard Sackville had a young son who he wished to be learned. He offered if Ascham would name a tutor. He asked Ascham to write a treatise on the right order of teaching. So the Schoolmaster was the result of that. And the Schoolmaster containing two books. And the first book, Teaching the Bringing Up of Youth, Ascham gives much practical advice for the young. So this is all about that. And he expressed his dissatisfaction with two important themes of Thomas Mallory's Morte Arthur. So I hope you understood this. And again, another character, George Gascoigne. And about George Gascoigne, we have to know one thing about the Discourse on Adventure, Master F.J., an account of courtly intrigue and early English prose fiction. He was poet and dramatist. And why is famous? He is considered the most significant of the early Elizabethan era, following those of. Anyway, that's not. So, certain notes on instruction concerning the making of verse or rhyme in English. So, that's why Gascoigne is famous. See, most of the work, this trend was far earlier than Sydney, and he started. George Gascoigne wrote on again rhyme. Can you tell me other people who has written on rhyme? And one is The Defense of Rhyme by Samuel Butler, right? And the certain notes on instruction concerning the making of verse or rhyme in English, 1575. And it is considered the first essay in English versification, and then later everything came. So he discussed the system of St. John in details while addressing technical aspects of versification such as word order, stanza, forms, and rhyme schemes. So Gascoigne also emphasized the significance of fine invention. The poet emphasized the importance of poetic conceit, hiding the obvious through imaginative and creative expression. Got it? Only I'm introducing this work, so you will have the idea about. Actually, you are getting prepared for the main critic who will come in your way soon. And we'll just move. George Puttenham, life span 1529 to 1590. We know he's an English writer and literary critic, and he's very famous for the art of English poetry. So, as I told you, I started before, right? So, he's the author of the influence Handbook on Poetry and Rhetoric, the Art of English Poetry, and which was published in 1589. The Art of English Poetry, what he says that The poets were the first priest, prophets, legislator, and politician in the history of mankind. And the author goes on to describe various types of poetry. In Art of English Poesy, the first guidebook of poetry was talking about various types of poetry, and that these types are religious, didactic, satirical, and epitaph. So he discussed four type of poetry, and these are religious, didactic, satirical, and epitaph. You should remember just only the name. I'm just explaining them. See, you are getting more confused, right? Because only you knew about Gushan and Philip Sidney, where these people now come from. These days, it's trend in net also that they have started asking about contemporary of Sydney in literary criticism. That's why we have these works already. You are one step ahead of the exam also. Next is Stephen Gauchon. Now we are stepping up into Philip Sidney. Tell me till now everything is clear, and tell me if you have known this before. So the question is, did you know people before Stephen Gauchon that they did all this work? Write in the chat box yes or no. So were you aware of these works before or no? Yes or no? Chat in the write in the chat box yes or no. Keith says he didn't know that there were so many things before Sydney as well. Good. And any other? Now Kirti knows that she knows what happened before Sydney also. Anyway, we'll start with Stephen Gauchon. And Gauchon, as we know, is an English satirist. Anjali also says she didn't know that before. So he was an English satirist who Stephen Gauchon, and he wrote most of you must have known School of Abuse. So Gauchon retired to the country where he acted as tutor to the sons of gentlemen. So the debate started from here, School of Abuse. And Priya also says he didn't know that. And great that you guys know right now everything. And we'll again continue. The School of Abuse, first debate 1579, containing a pleasant invective against poets, pipers, players. That is the full title. Players, jesters, such like, caterpillar, and commonwealth. And his criticism of contempt, here you have to pay more attention to it, because if you know this, you will understand from what all kind of blame that Sidney Gauchon put on poetry, and for that what Philip Sidney has defended. So just his criticism of contemporary theatre was that it lacks purpose and is used to promote the business of prostitution. That's what he said. And in his subsequent pamphlet, Gauchon attacked that tragedy are characterized by their evil and criminal themes and settings. So according to Gauchon, the tragedies are characterized by their evil and criminal themes and settings. He also says comedies for their bawdry, flattery, immorality. So many claim that he made about drama, right? So characters are drawn from various backgrounds, including cooks, knaves, and parasites. So that was actually his attack, these points. And Gauchon dedicated his book to Sir Philip Sidney. And Philip Sidney, 1554, now is going to reply who's Stephen Gershon. And Sydney was you have to pay attention because one question you are getting from this itself. So as we know, Sydney's lifespan is 1554 to 1586, and he was an English poet, courtier scholar, as we know, and he's one of the and soldiers remembered as one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan age. And his work Aristotle and Stella, The Defense of Poesy, is remembered as the defense. Remember, it can be called as apology or can called as defense as well. But don't get confused with P.B. Shelley. You only remember as an apology for poetry, but sometime it might be referred as the defense of poesy also. So you just go with an apology of for poetry, and it was dedicated and it was published where the Countess of Pembroke's Arcade. I mean, these are the work actually. Yeah, Aristotle and Stella he was famous for, and then apology for poetry and the Countess of Pembroke Arcadia. An apology for poetry will begin, and all these points you see, we have to pay really good attention to it, and there are so many things in that itself that will get everything is there. The essay is quite big, and I have just collected in small points, and it is all based on the PYQs, whatever they have asked and whatever is important in literary criticism, and especially in apology for poetry. I hope everybody is ready. Shall we begin an apology for poetry? Write apology in chat box quickly. Okay, great. So, the first thing, apology for poetry, not poem, but we can just skip. It is written in 1580s and was first published after his death in 1595. Priya says, yes, we'll begin apology. And why you're apologizing? Tell me also. Anyway, he was inspired by Stephen Gershon. Gershon, as we know, he attacked what? Poetry by his abuse of school of abuse. And what he talked about, that tragedy are characterized by, he criticized tragedies, comedies and poetry. Got it? And in defense, it was inspired by Stephen Gershon, former playwright, who dedicated his attack on the English stage, the school of abuse, to Sydney in 1579. And how, when he replied after how many? 10, 15, 16 years, right? So that was the gap, so big gap. So addresses more general objection to poetry, such as those raised by Plato. And he also addresses Plato, who started that debate, right? That we talked about, that poetry is the mother of life. It should be banned in in ideal state, and these kind of debate he also defended from. Addresses more general objection to poetry, such as those raised by Plato. So much attention is also given to Edmund Spenser and the Elizabethan stage. So remember that according to Sydney, there have been three general kinds of poetry, and that question is have already asked 7 times in net, 7 to 8 times, and past 3 years they have asked the same thing also. So that thing you have to pay really close attention to it, that what I'm going to tell you. So this question we have faced like 7-8 times already in net, so that's why it becomes very important. Remember, there have been 3 general kinds of poetry. The first is being religious, which imitates the inconceivable excellence of God. Second is philosophical, and the third is imaginative poetry was written by right poets who teach and delight. So remember the quote that also asks teach and delight. Write in the chat box teach and delight. Uh, according to Sydney, poetry is to teach and delight. Write in the chat box quickly teach and delight, everybody, whoever is there, so you will not forget. Teach and delight, that is the aim of the poetry. Got it? Write quickly teach and delight in the chat box. And of course you're gonna write philosophical and religious poetry and imaginative poetry. Write 3 point also. You will start with religious, philosophical, imaginative. Write quickly in the chat box also if you have time, or you can just write in your notebook also. Great. Priya said teach and delight. Anjali said teach and delight. Kirti, if Kirti is there, she can also write. Great. Kirti also wrote teach and delight. Now we can just, so again we are going to write, everybody write religious, philosophical, imaginative. Write quickly these 3 point also. Everybody, religious, philosophical, imaginative. These three kind of poetry that he talked about. And the message was the poetry's aim should be to teach and delight. Great. So Sydney described poetry as creating a separate reality. Great. Anjali wrote religious, philosophical, and imaginative. So remember what you have learned, the backbone of the apology of the poetry by Sydney. These points are very important. It's like you know what it is there in whole that essay, in that apology. So teach and delight, religious, philosophical, imaginative. So this question you will definitely get in that. Pakka, shall we move? So Sydney starts, again these quotes are very important. He also described that poetry as creating a separate reality. And I'll just go one more time, that Plato says poetry does not represent reality. It is a lie. Again, and Aristotle said what? Aristotle said it is the imitation of life, right? And here Sydney says it's creating a separate reality. So we got 3 point, we can separate 3%, right? Plato said it is a lie. Aristotle said it is the imitation of life, imitative you can say, and here Sydney describes separate reality. So that 3 point we already got. And again Sydney asserts that there is no art delivered to mankind that hath not the works of nature for his principal object. So that was the quote once. It's a very important quote in this apology. So he said there is no art delivered to mankind. So according to him, according to Sydney, there is no any art that delivered to mankind that had not the works of nature for his principal object. So if you have time, you can just write one thing. Plato says lie, poetry is a lie, and Aristotle says imitation, and here Sydney says separate reality. Okay. And poetry as mimesis. So he also supported Aristotle. So you can just click supported, or you can just kind of add symbol like hug. Okay. Sydney supported or handshake. Who? Aristotle. So you can say, you can put in code Sydney handshake poetry. So do we have that? symbol here. Let me see if we have. So where Sydney, handshake is there. Let me check. Handshake is not there, just praise है. तो Sydney praise. Who? Aristotle. So Sydney praise Aristotle for poetry as mimesis by supporting Aristotle poetry as imitation. Great. Kirti is really focusing so much in this, and she says that poetry, Plato said lie, Aristotle imitation, and Sydney separate reality. Very good. Shabash. And also one more, Sydney praises Aristotle for that poetry as an imitation. And remember, this code and whatever we are doing, it will be till your 18th to 19th century, somewhere of like T.S. Eliot, till T.S. Eliot, these kind of code. So you will know the relation between from the beginning of the debate to your modern thing. So like you will have more knowledge than the other people. And even some of the professors, that they only talk about one or two person, but here we are going to discuss like a real chain into it. So got it. Sydney describes poetry, what? Separate reality. Sydney asserts that there is no art delivered to mankind that hath not the works of nature for its principal object, and poetry as mimesis by supporting Aristotle poetry as imitation. So he also says poetry is mimesis. And he says one more thing, the poet is a creator. Sydney says the poet is a creator. And again, what Plato says? Plato said that poetry is the mother of lies. Again, anyway, the poet is a creator here. The true poet must be able to teach and delight. That we have already discussed, and that is the backbone of the apology. Great. Priya also wrote Plato lie, Aristotle imitation, Sydney separate reality. Good. A view that dates back to Horace, who said poetry must tease and please. So one more is there. You just in write. You can just write Horace, teach and please. That's why we have mentioned Horace in the beginning. So Horace says teach and please, and here Sydney says teach and delight. Okay, and here to defend Plato, like Sydney supported Aristotle, no, for the mimesis, the imitation of poetry, and here Sydney talk about Plato's that argument against poetry. He said that the least liar, that the poets are least liar. So that also you can say in write in dash what Plato says, the liar, and according to Sydney, that poet is the least liar. That is very important also. Very good. Horace, teach and please, and Sydney, teach and delight. And also Plato says that the poetry is a lie, and here he defends and says the poets and poetry are the least liar. Good. The least liar in the write in the chat, least liar. Any one of you? And he says the poet never claimed to know the truth, nor make circles around your imagination, nor rely on authority. Great. Anjali wrote Plato said the liar. Plato the liar, Sydney least liar. That's good. You will remember with that. Good. Very good. Anyway, according to Sydney, drama is observing neither rules of honest civility nor of skillful poetry, and thus cannot do justice to this genre. Again, one more statement he said, two statement. When we, I think, the least liar first, and he also says that poets never claim to know the truth, make circles around your imagination, nor rely on authority. Plato says poetry is liar, and Sydney says least liar. Very good, Priyas. Everybody is doing so good. I hope you will remember till your exam. Anyway, we'll revise before the exam. So, according to Sydney, drama is observing neither rules of honest civility nor of skillful poetry, and thus cannot do justice to the genre. Again, poetry leads men to be virtuous. Another message is there in apology. Poetry leads men to be virtuous, and poetry is superior to history and philosophy. And remember, again, we have to know this. Again, in code you can write poetry is superior. You can just write greater than symbol and then history and philosophy. And remember, Plato said that philosophy is greater than everything. Correct? That you should write. Poetry greater than history and philosophy. Who says? Sydney. And Plato says that philosophy is greater than whatever the subject. So greater than sign. Got it? Write this, anyone in the chat, please. And then we'll start with his division of apology. So there are so many things in apology for poetry, right? There's not like simple thing like you just know the name and that is enough for the exam. Never. So as I said, just write this, whatever I said here, about that poetry is superior to history and his apology is divided. Great. So Plato said poetry is superior to history and philosophy. You can just write everything in symbol, no Anjali, you don't have to type so much, just simple like this. Plato says, actually it was not Plato who said poetry is superior, that here you are wrong, okay? So it is not Plato, it is Sydney. It is Sydney who says that poetry is superior, that poetry will have just superior to history and philosophy. That kind of code you have to write. Okay. Sydney says poetry superior to history and philosophy. That greater than sign, no, simple. So in that way you'll remember more, and in writing also it's small. And Plato said that philosophy is above than any other form of literature or whatever, right? So Plato says that. So now we'll just move to his apology is divided into how many? A part, there are 8 parts, and that you should remember. Exordium, narration, teach and delight, propositio, confirmation. In narration he says teach and delight. In that part he talked about teach and delight. So confirmation, perfection, reflection, digratio and perorati. So these 8, if you can remember the name, that's very good. Otherwise you should know teach and delight comes in narration. And here this is all very important. Whatever is bold in, it's like 90% of the things that you have to remember. So epic and heroic. And you should remember, Sidney talked about these all. He talked about epic and heroic. He talked about pastoral also, this type of poetry. He talked about elegiac. He talked about iambic. He talked about satire, comedy, tragedy, and lyric. So epic and heroic is the top, loftiest, inspire and instruct. So according to Sidney, epic and heroic are the top form of poetry. So he says that epic and poetry is the top, loftiest, and which inspire and instruct. Okay, again you have to write that epic and poetry inspire and instruct. Write in the chat, inspire and instruct. Epic and heroic is the top, loftiest, inspire and instruct. Only remember that. And pastoral is according to the second top. If not top, second top. And it represents humble life. And elegiac is pity. Iambic is wickedness. Satire is radical. Comedy says delight and laughter, folly and weakness. Remember, Aristotle talked about comedy that it is for lower people, and tragedy is for the upper class. Upper people, right? That he talked about. So tragedy, according to Sidney, is uncertainty of the word, pity and awe, the fall of the tyrant, unity of time, place and action. And he talked about lyric, he praised worthy and courage. And little bit more message is that poetry promotes virtue. Poets are not liars. He defended who? He defended against Plato, who said that poetry is the lie. And here he says poets are the least liars. Men abuse poetry. This is because of Gushon that he put that thing. So men abuse poetry. Like Plato banished poets from the ideal state, but Sidney argues the misuse of poetry which Stephen Gushon was doing. So the decline of poetry and drama, poets are made, not born. So these all are content in whole defense of apology for poetry. So I hope everything is clear. Did you like the content that I have collected? And this is all in your book, Literary Criticism. It's like a gem for the literary criticism and theory student. It's like it has everything. Even if you're doing your PhD, you can just get some term from that and apply in your thesis as well. So as I said again, apology for poetry has so much things that you have studied before, but I don't think so. I also studied apologies for poetry, but I never got the insight of it, what it was actually about. Got it? Tell me everything is clear on apology. Tell clear in the chat box quickly. So we'll move to Thomas Lodge and we'll try to finish Renaissance today itself. Great. Not too much. Only few things are left that we can finish today. We still have actually 1 hour is over, but we'll try 10 more minutes and we'll finish it off. Okay, so write clear in the chat box. Priya says clear. Kirti, Vidya and Anjali, where are you? Is it clear? Kirti says clear. And of course Anjali says clear. Anyway, Thomas Lodge. We'll just begin. Thomas Lodge. And remember, as we know, Abuse of Poetry wrote who? Gershon. Apology wrote, Sydney wrote Apology, and here Thomas wrote again one more defense of poetry, but here poetry, music, and stage. Again, he replied Stephen Gershon again. So he was the main culprit who started everything, right? Anyways, the defense of poesy is defense of poetry, music, and stage plays, 1518, where he defended all the claims that Stephen Gershon made in his School of Abuse. And he responded with his defense of poesy. So he also wrote in defense of poesy. So that trend was happening. Okay, so that's why they give so much confusing option in the exam. But when you know what it is about, it will be easy to answer. So anyway, his defense claims that a handful of astray poets prove nothing for the whole set. It shows a certain restraint, though both forceful and learned. You just have to remember the name of it. And again, Sir John Harrington was also another important critic and philosopher at that time. He defended poetry in his A Brief Apology for Poetry. So it was Sir John Harrington also wrote about apology, and here he said a prefix to his translation of Aristotle's Orlando Furioso. So it was translated in English for the first time. So in the apology, he emphasized the various levels of meaning that poetry allows: historical, moral, allegorical. So only we have to remember the name. And again, Thomas Campion, that is one of the also very important critic at that time and poet also. He in exam we are not getting these days about his poetic side, poetic career, but we are getting his question from his literary areas, and that because of the observation in the art of English poesy. So remember, there are so many things that and remember that observation in the art of poesy against the vulgar and unartistic custom of rhyming. So here in the book, Thomas Campion actually criticized the rhyme. He says that there is no need for all the rhyming schemes and all, right? And he says that he actually talked about against the vulgar and unartificial custom of rhyming, and arguing in favor of rhymeness was based on the classical. And Samuel Daniel criticized Thomas Campion's the observation in the art of English poesy in his defense of rhyme. So that is why this is very important. Thomas Campion's simple, like Sydney replied Stephen Gershon's School of Poetry, right? And here Samuel Daniel defended from Thomas Campion's observation in the art. So they are all important because the relationship between each other. So each other work. So Samuel Daniel criticized Campion's work, and he defended poetry in his work called Defense of Rhyme, which was published in 1603. I hope you got it. As we know, Samuel Daniel is famous. Late Elizabethan and early Jacobean period, he became a poet, playwright, and historian, and we know him for the civil wars between the House of Lancaster and York and his cycle Delia. And on Delia, we already saw many questions, so I have just mentioned the name here. And in the critical perspective, Samuel Daniel is quite important figure because of his work at Defense of Rhyme, which he actually responded to Thomas Campion's observation in the arts of English poesy. And now Francis Bacon, if you're thinking Francis Bacon would be big, we are just talking about his criticism part. And why he's very important? Because of the use of his language. That's why he's mentioned here. And he says one question was there, no, in ABC form of question in the previous year question 2023, that his works are seen as scientific method, and he used what that deductive reasoning, right, and as contributing to the scientific method, and remained influencer through the later stages of scientific revolution. And why Bacon is remembered as the father of empiricism? So that word is quite important, and the author argued that it was possible to obtain scientific knowledge solely through inductive reasoning. It was not deductive, inductive reasoning and careful observation of natural event. And he argued that science could be achieved by using a skeptical and methodological approach, whereby scientists aim to avoid misleading themselves. That's why he says that he supported scientific revolution. So I remember that. One more, we should remember empiricism, which is actually a kind of research that is quite important in humanism also. I mean, all kind of whatever you learn through scientific observation comes into empiricism. So the advancement of learning is 1605. Very important. Taxonomic structure, tennis. He actually, these words I have mentioned because they are quite important term which happened in the advancement of learning. The taxonomic structure, tennis, three types: narrative, representative, and elusive. And its full title of the science and advancement of learning is divine. Remember why the advancement of learning is important? Because of a couple of things, which of first of them is the so remember, first we just talk about how he was influenced. So he was influenced with encyclopedia by Jean Leron D'Alembert and Denis Diderot. So that's why it's important. Denis Diderot, very important, because you might face if they ask about the influence. So Bacon's biography essays, Catherine Drinker Bowen credits him with writing a pioneer essay supporting empirical philosophy. And the various branches of study are examined in depth. Human understanding is divided into segments. So that's what he mentioned in his work. Memory, which relates to history; imagination, which relates to poetry; and reason, which relates to philosophy. And he is also remembered for and Bacon discussed different type of poetry. Here he talked about narrative and representative. In narrative, it is an imitation of history. In representative, the action is presented on a stage in a dramatic form. And he also talked about tennis in the work, tennis game. So that as tennis is a game of no use in itself, but of a great use in respect it maketh a quick eye, a body ready to put itself in all possession. So in the mathematics, the use which is collateral and intervenient is no less worthy than that which is principal and intended. Last is we have Milton, and Milton is important in criticism only for one work, and that is Areopagitica or Areopagitica. So this Areopagitica is a speech of Mr. Milton for the liberty of unlicensing printing press. So because of the title, we understand what it is about. So that's why it's Milton is important in the criticism, and also because of his blank verse that he's important in literary criticism and theory. Got it? So I hope this class was fruitful and you must have learned so much and so many things that you didn't know before. And tomorrow, of course, we're gonna continue the class and we'll start neoclassical criticism unlock, where we are going to talk we'll talk about Thomas Hobbes, John Dryden, Nicholas Boileau, John Locke, John Dennis, Alexander Pope, Joseph Addison, Jonathan Swift, Edmund Burke, David Hume, Samuel Johnson, and Edward Young, Sir Joshua Renaud, Immanuel Kant, Mary Wollstonecraft, which is discussed in feminism. So this section tomorrow will be on neoclassical and criticism. So be there. I hope everything is clear, right? Wow, already very quick. Everybody wrote clear. Great. So we'll just wind up the class. I hope you liked it. If you liked the class, give thumbs up. If you didn't like, you know what, opposite of it. Anyway, definitely you should always like the video. Okay, so in that way we'll just anyway. So it was good session, I hope, and tomorrow we are going to discuss neoclassical and criticism. So bye bye, have a good day, great evening, and enjoy. And also give likes, when you are watching. Whenever you are in classroom, you should give press that like button. It will help us. And I will know that people already came and watched. So anyway, okay, Anjali Priya Kirti, you have good evening and enjoy tomorrow. Don't forget to join tomorrow in the morning. I'll just give you one link of I'll post the link in your WhatsApp group, and I'll see you tomorrow.